This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good morning, Rabbi Glatstein. Parshas Vayishlach. So, one of the primary subjects of Parshas Vayishlach is the story of Yaakov Avinu, who wrestles with the Sarai Shel Esav. And the pasuk says, "Vayar ki lo yachaloi, vayiga b'chaf yarach Yaakov, v'ateka chaf yarach Yaakov b'heyavkoi imoi." And then we have the pasuk, which is a very mysterious pasuk, because it seems only to be a narrative instead of a commandment. The pasuk says, "Al kain lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael es gid hanasheh, asher al kaf hayarech ad hayom hazeh." This is why Klal Yisrael does not eat the gid hanasheh, which is on the hip socket, until today. So it's unclear if the pasuk is saying we are not allowed to, or this is merely what we do. Is this just Jewish custom? Is this actually halacha? Because this isser or story is not mentioned ever again in the Chumash. It's only mentioned before the Torah was given, and not mentioned ever again. So we know the rule of the Gemara in Sanhedrin, that whatever is said before the Torah was given, and then is not repeated after the Torah was given, so you would expect logically that this would be a mitzvah that applies to even goyim, after what's mentioned before the Torah is given, and it's not mentioned again after the Torah is given, so you would expect that all mankind is nizhar not to eat the gid hanasheh, and yet the Gemara in Sanhedrin says that anything which was nishnis before Sinai and not repeated again is only for Klal Yisrael and not for the Ummah Yisrael. So there are a lot of questions about gid hanasheh. How many gid hanashehs are there in an animal? I mean, if it's the sinew of the hind quarters, well, an animal has more than one hind quarter. The animal has two legs. Does it apply to behemoths? Does it apply to chayos? Does gid hanasheh have to be removed from karbanos that are not eaten? Does gid hanasheh apply to non-kosher animals or only to kosher animals? Could you get hana from a gid hanasheh? Basically, we know nothing about gid hanasheh. All the Torah says is al kain lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael gid hanasheh, but none of the details and none of the particulars are mentioned in relation to gid hanasheh. It's entirely dependent on what we call Torah Sheba'al Peh, and that is why, possibly more than any other halacha in the Torah, there is great disparity between the prushim, between those of us who keep the Masar of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and let's say, for instance, the Karaim. So, in the olden days, if you were a Karaite, you would not be able to shop in a kosher butcher store. Or vice versa. If you were a traditional Jew, you couldn't go to the butcher of the Karaim, because we had completely different understandings of what gid hanasheh was. And it's therefore not surprising, if you look in the Mordechai, if you look in the Shal Shuvah Shvas Yaakov, they call those who are not careful in gid hanasheh, they call them apikarsim. Why? Why were they more apikarsim than people who are not zahir and other halachas? It's because this mitzvah is more dependent on the interpretation of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and therefore those who don't follow the tradition obviously are more of the heretic type than those who don't follow and observe other mitzvahs. And what I want to bring to your attention is a story that basically shook the world. A story with one of the great Gedolim. What in the world? Yeah, it shook the world, like the Arab shook, right? So, this is a story about one of the most colorful all-time Gedolei Yisrael, one of the most distinguished Gedolei Yisrael of the 18th century, none other than Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz, Zecher Tzaddik Livracha, who lived from 1690 to 1764. And Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz wrote, at least according to a certain bibliographies, 35 different titles, but by now there are at least probably 70 titles. And in most of the universities in the world, they still have kisvei yad of Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz that are unpublished. So, for example, if you go to the library in Oxford, or you go to the Oriental Studies of the Institute of Oriental Studies of the Russian Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg, you will find manuscripts of Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz. Okay, now if you think about the brilliance and the greatness of Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz, without knowing about his personality, you would expect he must have been some kind of very righteous recluse who just sat in his Dalet Amos poring over his books. but he was a very colorful personality, and he was out in the world, and he debated with Minim and Apikarsim and Christians and Karaites, and he had the acquaintances of many unusual people, including Nehemiah Chiyun, and his very outgoing and colorful personality and success and talent also, aside from awarding him many friends, also awarded him many enemies, including many Gedolei Yisrael. As we know, Rabbi Yaakov Emden was not the best friend of Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz. And he was not only the author of many of the great old-time Svarim, the Yaros Davash, and the Urim V'Tumim, and the Kresi Uplesi, but he was also the chief Maggid, or the chief of Darshan in Prague, and the Rosh Hashiva in Prague. And not only that, many say he was the greatest Marbitz Torah of the last 500 years. Even by account of his detractors, he taught more than 20,000 Talmidim in his lifetime. Wow. Kimat, all of them wrote notes on his Shiurim. So if you were a Rav in the 18th century, chances were you were a Talmud of Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz. Okay, be it as it may, there was a very interesting episode that took place that's recorded in the Kresi Uplesi, and a lot of tshuvos were written based on that incident. Okay, so take a look in your sheets. So number 1, the Kresi Uplesi at the end of Siman Samache. We know there's a concept of being menaker. Menaker means removing the sciatic nerve, the gid hanasheh, or in English it's called a porger. A porger is deveining, or a porger is somebody who removes the gid hanasheh. Nowadays, they don't even deal with it. You know, if you go to the butcher here, they just take off the whole hind part. But what? Yeah, but we live in America, and over here they don't deal with it. But in the Kresi place of Yehonasan Eibeshutz, aside from being a Goyin Olam, he considered himself specifically expert in the art of deporging, of deveining, of removing the Gid Hanosh, and he talks about a story. He says, "V'hinei bizmani, in my times, haya menaker echad, there was a porger, afilu bal Torah umumcha lamoid. He was a Talmud Chacham. He was proficient. V'neshtavish b'daitoi, and he got a little confused. Loimar al gid acher shehu hagid hoamiti. He said about a different nerve that was the Gid Hanosh. But nobody takes out that nerve. We take out a different nerve. He said everybody got it wrong. V'ad hayoim hazeh ta'inu nachnu v'avoseinu begid she'eno gid she'asa Torah. And until today, we all were mistaken, us and our forefathers, with the gid, that this is not the gid that the Torah said. In other words, he claimed that we're taking out the wrong gid, and that the meat that everyone's eating is basically chazer treif. It has the gid hanosh in it. This guy went traveling throughout Germany. Umarish Habrius, he created a major commotion. Ad Shabala Prague. Not only he came all the way to Prague. V'hitzi advar v'lefanai, and he presented his opinion before me. V'lefnei chachmei hoyer hagoinim. Ba'ani chakarti, I investigated, said Rabbi Yonasan. Uvadakti esadover, I checked into the matter. Umatsasi, and I found that what he claimed to be the Gid Hanosh, shazeh hagid einoi rak bebehemois zecharim v'loy bebehemois nekevos. That this gid that he identifies as Gid Hanosh is only existing in male animals and not in female animals. And says Rabbi Yonasan, but I showed him va'az heresi loy, and I showed him smag. Who's the smag? The smag is the Sefer Mitzvahs Gedolos, which was written by, let's see if it's right, Rav Moshe Mikusi. The smag was written by Rav Moshe Mikusi. Shekasav the Gid Hanosh noyeg bezecharim unekevos. That the Gid Hanosh is noyeg by males and by females. Ha! So I slugged him out of the waters. Obviously, he doesn't know what he's talking about because he identified a nerve that only exists in male animals. And I showed him the smag. The smag says that the Gid Hanosh is prevalent in male and females. And through this argument, I completely befuddled his words. And therefore, says Rabbi Yonasan, V'al kopanim ein lismoich benikor kiyim al baki. Do not rely, when it comes to porging, only on a proficient person, v'yarei Hashem, meirabim, In other words, you better make sure that the guy who takes out your get hanasheh knows what he's doing and he's God-fearing. Says Rabbi Yehonasan, and who do I rely on? Who is Baki and who's a Yerei Shamayim? Nobody. And therefore, you basically can't eat meat. And I personally will not eat meat unless I myself take out the get hanasheh. Says Rabbi Yehonasan, Eibeshutz, from the time that my seichel kicked in, shalamadati hilchos nikar, that I learned the laws of nikar, liyos baki bahen, to be proficient in it, uvish maisem, in the precise terminology of the names. Lo samachti al menakar, I did not rely on any porger, ki im masha yisi menakar ba'atzmi. I only relied on what I removed myself, v'yagia kapi achalti, and only I ate from what I myself removed. And it's interesting, because Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshutz was known to be an expert in Gid hanasheh. So, for example, one of the seminal works on Hilchos Nikor was written by somebody, Rav David Deitch. Who's Rav David Deitch? Rav David Deitch was a contemporary of the Noid Yehuda and the Chassam Sofer. If you look in the Tshuvas of the Noid Yehuda, the Noid Yehuda writes many Tshuvas to Rav David Deitch. He gives them titles, Adam Chazak Kebarzel. So Rav David Deitch wrote a Sefer, Tzina David. And who did he ask for a Haskama from? Rav Yonasan Eibeshutz. And in the Haskama, Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz writes to Rav David Deitch, he says, Ubikesh lahaskim al yadi. Rav David Deitch came to me, says Rabbi Yehonasan, to get a Haskama. Liyosi baki ba'amanos hazeh, because I'm an expert in this field. Ubaki bahen, I'm proficient. Uvishmoisan. V'ra'isi masha, because I saw what he wrote. V'gam dibarti ma'panu ma'pam, I spoke to him face to face, and I went with him to the butchers. V'ra'isi ki ein boy shakula, I saw there is no flaws in his work. So this is Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshutz, Rosh Hashiva, Marbitz Torah, Darshan, Baki in Nikor. The problem that shook the world was the argument Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshutz used to debunk this Porger. And he says he found the smag, and the smag says that the Gid hanasheh exists in male and female. And the problem is that loy haya v'loy nivra, there is no such smag. There, you could read every word the smag ever wrote. The smag never said that the Gid hanasheh is prevalent in male and female, and Kemat doesn't say it anywhere that the Gid hanasheh exists in both male and female. So what exactly was Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshutz talking about? Now you need to know that B'chlal, the concept of Gid hanasheh, was one which caused a lot of controversy to Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshutz personally. So, for example, Rav Yaakov Emden, in one of the books that he wrote, which is not in print anymore, obviously, in the book Vayokom Eidos B'Yaakov, he writes about that he believes Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshutz should be banished from the city of Prague, and that's because Rabbi Yaakov Emden accused Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshutz of intentionally serving Gid hanasheh to the community. In fact, in the Sefer Vayokom Eidos B'Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes that one of the things that he accused Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshutz of was being a follower of Shin Sadi, Shabtai Tzvi, of being a Sabbatean. In fact, we know one of the main practices of the Sabbatians were that they ate Gid hanasheh. Now, why did they eat Gid hanasheh? Well, they had a interpretation of the Zohar HaKadosh. A very interesting interpretation. And that is, they pointed out that in the Pasuk, Al Kein Lo Yochlu B'nei Yisrael, Es Gid hanasheh. What's the Es? Al Kein Lo Yochlu B'nei Yisrael, Es Gid hanasheh. So they said as follows. The Zohar HaKadosh says that how many lavin are there in the Torah? How many negative prohibitions are in the Torah? 365. Yeah, I mean in the Torah, not in anywhere else. 365. How many sinews are there in the body? 365. We know there are 248 positive commandments. Can I get the limbs?
Say it every day.
Right? No, we don't say it every day. That's only if you say L'Shem Yichud.
Yeah.
Rabbi Yaakov Emden wasn't saying L'Shem Yichud. Yeah. So you have 365 sinews, and you have 365 lavin. Says the Zohar HaKadosh, the 365 lavin correspond to the 365 sinews. The Gid hanasheh corresponds to... Okay, that's one thing. Then how many days of the year are there? 365 days a year. Each lav corresponds to a different day of the year. The lav of Gid hanasheh corresponds to Tisha B'Av. Mamela, the Shabtam said, that the lav of Al Kein Lo Yucham Yisrael Gid hanasheh is only so long as we commemorate Tisha B'Av. But when Mashiach comes, and we won't have a Tisha B'Av, then you'll be allowed to eat Gid hanasheh. And Mamela, one of the prominent features of a follower of Shabtai Tzvi was, dinner every night was Gid hanasheh, because they believed Kfar Ba Mashiach. If you were a follower of Shabtai Tzvi, you knew what you were having for supper. Maybe a little chicken, a little potato, and a little Gid hanasheh on the side. Mamela, they darshan Al Kein Lo Yochim B'nei Yisrael. S stood for Tisha B'Av. That you're only not allowed to eat Gid hanasheh as long as you're celebrating Tisha B'Av, commemorating Tisha B'Av. But when you're not commemorating Tisha B'Av, which the Shabtam did not, Mamela, you're allowed. It's not on the sheet. The sheet cannot handle this Maramaka. If you're not commemorating Tisha B'Av, you do not have to be zar not to Gid hanasheh. Rabbi Yaakov Emden accuses Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz of partaking in the Gid hanasheh.
I mean, this argument about whether it's only in Zachar or only...
Well, one second. So, the concept of Gid hanasheh was one that was controversial for Rabbi Yaakov Emden and Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz. And this is the argument that Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz used to debunk this Porger who came to Prague. And the question on Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz, as we're about to see, is that what is this Maramokum that he's presenting, that there's a smag that says that the Gid hanasheh applies in Zecharim and in Nekevos, Lai Hayav Lai Nivra, there is no such Maramokum. To the point where there's a sefer called Taldos Adam. Taldos Adam was written by Rabbi Cheskel Feivel. Cheskel Feivel published this work in the year 1809, and you have it on your sheet in number 4. Rabbi Cheskel Feivel wrote 2 volumes. He was the Magid Meisharim, the Moira Tzedek in Vilna, from 1811 until his Petira. And he wrote 2 volumes. He wrote a volume, Taldos Adam Chilek Aleph, and he wrote a volume, Taldos Adam Chilek Beis. And in Taldos Adam Chilek Beis, he writes something which, unfortunately, the Haskalah chapped onto. And he writes how, a human being has to be very careful that lest the person is very apt and prone to make a mistake. That the human mind, as clear as sometimes a person thinks they may think, nevertheless, the human mind is very prone to error. One is very prone to make a mistake. And he proves this by showing how even the smartest people, even the greatest Gedolim, have made mistakes. And one of the examples that he uses is none other than Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz. And when did Rabbi Yehonasan make a mistake? Says the Taldos Adam, on this occasion. And unfortunately, this is something that the early Haskalah, they quote from this very extensively. But the Sefer Taldos Adam is one of the classic Musar Svarim. And this Chilek Beis of the Taldos Adam is actually a biography of Reb Shlomo Zalman of Volozhin. Who's Reb Shlomo Zalman of Volozhin? The younger brother of Reb Chaim of Volozhin. And he writes the following. Take a look at number 4. He writes, he says, Hinei nasanu libeinu lasor achar makar advar ma'ila b'smag. I try to find the source in the smag where he talks about Gid hanasheh. Bikashnu sham le'matzanu. I looked there and I didn't find any remez that this applies to male or female. And I looked in the smak, because after all, I said, maybe there was a printer's error. Maybe it didn't mean the smag, Sefer Mitzvahs Gedolah. Maybe it means the smak, Sefer Mitzvahs Katan. Who wrote the Sefer Mitzvahs Katan? Rav Isaac Mikorbel. And also over there, I didn't find any remez to the fact that the Gid hanasheh exists in male and female. But, says the Taldos Adam, what Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz must have meant was not the smag and not the smak. He must have meant the Sefer HaChinuch. Because if you look in the Sefer HaChinuch, look at number 6, the 3rd mitzvah of the 613. Who was the Sefer HaChinuch? Many people think that, what? Many people of Aaron of Barcelona, and therefore they mistakenly think it's written by the Ra'ah. The Ra'ah was a contemporary of the Rajba They were both Rabbanim in Barcelona. However, the Ra'ah did not write the Sefer HaChinuch. The Sefer HaChinuch was probably written by a student of Rav Aaron of Barcelona, his name was Rav Aaron, but was not written by the Ra'ah, who wrote the Bedek Habayis. The Rashba, interesting, the Rashba wrote a Sefer, remember, called Torah Habayis. Torah Habayis are the halachas of the dietary laws of kashrus. And the Ra'ah, Rav Aaron of Barcelona, wrote a work critiquing the Torah Habayis called Bedek Habayis. Bedek Habayis means the crack in the house. And another work appeared on the scene defending the Torah Habayis and the Bedek Habayis called Mishmeres Habayis. And the Mishmeres Habayis was written anonymously. But the Rashba in a tshuva sort of discloses that he was the one, in fact, who wrote the Sefer Mishmeres Habayis. Okay, be it as it may, the Sefer HaChinuch was written by a Rishon, but not Rav Aaron of Barcelona, a student of his. He writes like this: Mahu Hagid, what's the Gid hanasheh? He says, Sha'anu chayam l'chatei dachrav, uve'eza behema noyeg, umi neman al nikurai. You got to look in the Gemara in Chulan. V'noyheges mitzvah zu b'chol makoim, u'b'chol zman, b'zacharim of an akeva. Oh, we hit jackpot. That's what Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz mean. You see, the Sefer HaChinuch writes, the Gid hanasheh is in male animals and in female animals. That's what Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz meant. He didn't mean the smag, and he didn't mean the smak. He meant the Sefer HaChinuch who writes, Zacharim on akevos.
You can't eat it. The Zachar and the Keva can't eat it.
You can't eat a Zachar and you can't eat an akeva? What?
The Zachar and the Keva, it applies to them also, that they can't eat to get it up.
So ask the Toldos Adam, but the problem is Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz seemed to have made a colossal error. Because when the Sefer HaChinuch says it's noyeg b'zacharim n'kevos, he doesn't mean the Gid hanasheh is in male animals and female animals. He means men can't eat the Gid hanasheh and women can't eat the Gid hanasheh. Kedarkoi b'chol makoim, like the Sefer HaChinuch writes by every single mitzvah. V'noyheges b'zacharim n'kevos. And Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz obviously misread, says the Toldos Adam, the Sefer HaChinuch, because he didn't realize that whenever the Sefer HaChinuch writes "V'noyheges b'zacharim n'kevos," it doesn't mean men can't eat it. He doesn't mean it exists in male, it exists in female. He meant, everybody knows, we all know over here, the Sefer HaChinuch means that men can't eat the Gid hanasheh and women. So concludes the Toldos Adam. Ume'ata yisa kol adam kal v'chomer ba'atzmai. So now let everybody make an a fortiori argument on their own. If these giants, if these whales, namely Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz, was able to be caught up in the trap of mistake, so what about us tadpole of the swamp like us? In other words, if the big fish made a mistake, what are you going to say about the little tadpole, about the little goldfish? And therefore, says the Toldos Adam, everybody should endear the expression of accept the truth from whoever it is, and God should always guide us on the path of truth. Because if Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz made a blunder like this, says the Toldos Adam, you could just imagine how careful we have to be not to make a mistake. Well, obviously, this doesn't sit well with a lot of people. That Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz would have made such an egregious error to read a Sefer HaChinuch in a way that none of us would have read it. But again, what did Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz mean when he said, if you look in the smag, you'll find it's noyeg b'zacharim uvenekevos. It doesn't exist in the smag, it doesn't exist in the smak, and if he meant the Sefer HaChinuch, then that's not how you read the Sefer HaChinuch. Well, the Chassam Sofer in the Tshuvos in Yerodea, who boldly and courageously comes to the defense of Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz. And the Chassam Sofer says like this: somebody by the name of Rabbi Avram, and this is a tshuva printed in 1830 to a Rabbi Avram who we don't know exactly who this is, and Rabbi Avram asked Chassam Sofer, look at the crazy place where Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz tells us the story of the Porger and how he caused him to stumble up, presenting him this comment of the smag. It ain't in the smag, and if he means the Sefer HaChinuch, That's not what the Sefer HaChinuch. Comes the Heilige Chasam Sofer, and the Chasam Sofer says, Va'ani oimer divrei chachamim kayamim. I say the words of the sages stand. Why? Because let's clear. I know, and everybody knows, and certainly if anybody knew, Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz knew better, that when the Sefer HaChinuch writes, now what's interesting is, the Chasam Sofer doesn't get involved in the fact that there is no such comment in the Smag. He sort of takes it for face value, that if the crazy place he says, the Smag says, it's noyeg be zechar monakevois, then the Smag says it. So dealing with that existing maramakoim, the Chasam Sofer says, let's think for a second. Avada, what he means is, men and women can't eat a get hanasheh. But let's think for a moment. Why are women now to eat a get hanasheh? So you say, well, because it's a lav, and women are now to violate any of the lavin. But says Rabbi Yonasan, says the Chasam Sofer, wait a second, let's read the pasuk very carefully. Al kein lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael es get hanasheh. The B'nai Yisrael can't eat the get hanasheh. So why can't B'nai Yisrael eat the get hanasheh? So you say, what are you talking about? It always says B'nai Yisrael, and we never exclude B'nai Yisrael. Well, says Chasam Sofer, yes we do. Yes we do. Whenever there's a mitzvah sa'aseh that says B'nai Yisrael, we exclude B'nai Yisrael. Right? Vayem Hashem Shalimar Daber al Bnei Yisrael v'Marta Aleihem v'Yasu Lohem Tzitzis, and we say Bnei Yisrael v'Lei Bnei Yisrael. So why don't we say the same thing by Get hanasheh? That says Chasam Sofer. What are you talking about? Lavim are different. We know lavim. All women are chayiv and lavim. So says Chasam Sofer, not so fast. By some lavin we say only Bnei Yisrael and not Bnei Yisrael. What? Emor el hakoyanim B'nei Aharon. And what do we darshan? V'loi b'noi Saharon. And what lav is that talking about? Not becoming tamei. So let's think for a moment. Why is it that when Hashem commanded the B'nei Aharon not to become tamei, why do we darshan B'nei Aharon and not b'noi Saharon?
Because of the avodah.
So it must be that even though it's a lav, but if you could come up with a svara to be mechalek between men and women, then we will darshan b'nei v'loi b'nais. And there is a svara by Tuma that since the men do the avodah and the women don't do the avodah, it's reasonable to assume that only men are now to become tamei and women are allowed to become tamei. So says Chasam Sofer, I've got a svara by the Get hanasheh also. You know what my svara is? That if the sciatic nerve is only in male animals and not in female animals, that would be a svara to say only men are now to eat from the Get hanasheh and women should be allowed to, because only males have the Get hanasheh and females don't. So since there is a svara to differentiate between men and women by the Get hanasheh, namely that the sciatic nerve is only in male animals, not in female animals, then why don't we go back and darshan that al kein lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael is Get hanasheh, that only men are now to eat the Get hanasheh and females not? Must be, says the Chasam Sofer, from the fact that the halacha is that both men and women are now to eat Get hanasheh, it must be that the Get hanasheh exists both in males and in females. And that's how Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz debunked the Porger. He didn't mistakenly read the Smag when the Smag says Noiheges b'zecharim v'loi v'nekevois, that the Smag b'zecharim u'v'nekevois. He didn't make the mistake that what the Smag meant was that the Get hanasheh exists in both men and male and female animals. What? Actually, the Smag. The Chasam Sofer is assuming that it's the Smag, okay? Or whoever it is. He didn't mistakenly read that Rishon, that the Rishon is saying it exists in the male and the female animals. He read it the way we did, that the Isser is noig by men and women. But the fact that the Isser is noig in men and women means that the Get hanasheh must exist in both male and female, because if it only existed in male and didn't exist in female, then the halacha should be that only men are allowed to eat it and female are allowed to eat it. Basically, what's the Chasam Sofer doing? He's saying a ganze pilpul to explain what Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz must have meant when he debunked the Porger.
It doesn't answer the fact that there's no such citation.
There's no such.
Oh.
No such smart.
Okay, so then the Chassam Sofer is sort of accepting at face value. So we could go back and then say that Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz, or there's a printer's error and he meant the chinuch. And if the chinuch says that it's noyeg by men and women, that men and women are not to eat the hanasheh, then that could only make sense if the hanasheh exists in both male and female animals. So Rabbi Shlomo Kluger is very unhappy with this Chassam Sofer. First of all, he says, somebody asked Rabbi Shlomo Kluger. Rabbi Shlomo Kluger is one of the also leading Rabbanim of the 19th century. When the Beis Halevi went to learn Rabbanos, he went to learn Rabbanos from Rabbi Shlomo Kluger. And Rabbi Shlomo Kluger was presented this comment of the Chassam Sofer. And Rabbi Shlomo Kluger says, take a look in the top paragraph on the next sheet. That which you are unhappy with the words of the Chassam Sofer, Yafa Amar, good gesagt. It's one thing if you want to say pshat in a rishain with a whole long Torah, but to say that what Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz meant when he presented the Porger with the words of the Smag, that what Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz meant was, the Smag says women are allowed to eat it. And if women are allowed to eat it, it must be that the hanasheh exists in female animals. You can't interpret the words of an Achron in such a lengthy, long-winded way. If Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz meant that, he would have said it. You can interpret a Rishon that way, you can't interpret an Achron that way. He says, and by the way, he says a little bit further down, he says at the end of the paragraph that begins Ach, the second one, he says V'teima im yatsu dvar me'elu mipiv kadosh. It's a tema if Chassam Sofer ever said this tshuva. You know, somebody must have tampered. I can't believe that Chassam Sofer would have ever said such a thing. But he says, the Rav Shlomo Kluger says that I wonder, what's all the commotion about? First of all, the smag that's in front of me, I don't find that says anything that the Kresi Aplesi says. Maybe his version of the smag says this. And if that's what his version was, then he had a good argument. In other words, says Rav Shlomo Kluger, my version of the smag doesn't say what he says it says. He must have had a different edition, and if he had a different edition, so then he presented a good argument. Because, interesting, if the smag does say it, the smag doesn't usually say noiheg b'zacharim u'nekevos. The lashon of the smag consistently is not like the chinuch. The chinuch, when the chinuch wants to say that this is a mitzvah absorbed by men and women, he says b'zacharim u'nekevos. The smag would say what we would expect, noiheg b'nashim ve'anashim, anashim b'nashim. That would be a more correct way to say it. So if the smag actually says the charim and nekevos, he would mean not that men and women have to observe, but that it exists in both male and female. Normally, the typical way of saying male-female is zachor and nekeva. Okay, but says Shlomo Kluger in the paragraph, the third paragraph on the sheet. Ach heyois ki chipashti b'smag usmak. I looked in my smag, and I didn't find this lashon at all, and none of the other Rishonim say anything of the sort, but I did find it in the Sefer HaChinuch. But, says the Reb Shlomo Kluger, there is no way in the world that the Sefer HaChinuch means that the hanasheh exists in both male and female. Kedarkoi, the Sefer HaChinuch, when he says the Charim and Akevos, he means men and women have to observe the mitzvah. But, says Reb Shlomo Kluger, the answer that the Chassam Sofer gives, he says very, very sharp words. He says, "Chutz mimad have a derech petume mila upilpal." Besides the fact that it's just what he calls verbose, but it's a tema. Says Rav Shlomo Kluger, is it true that whenever you have a svara, you kedarshin b'nei Yisrael v'lo b'nei Yisrael, even by a lav? So he says, then we should darshan the following drasha: that women shouldn't have to keep Shabbos. Why? Because it says by Shabbos, what does it say? V'shamru b'nei Yisrael says Shabbos. Maybe only men have to keep Shabbos. So you say, well, we know that women have to make kiddush, and therefore let's make a hekesh. Just like they have a chayv in zachar, they'll be chayv in shamar. No! They're only chayv in kiddush because they're now to violate the lavin. So it's circular. So let's start the following way. Let's say women, since they don't have to keep a kiddush because it's a mitzvah say shazman grama, let's darshan, therefore they don't have to keep Shabbos either. Says Rav Shlomo Kluger, according to Chassam Sofer, we should absolve women from keeping Shabbos because we have a svara to say they're not chayiv in Shabbos. They don't have to keep the asay, what? Yeah. So says Rav Shlomo Kluger, it must be that it's not correct that just because we have a svara to exempt a woman, we won't then all of a sudden darshan b'nei Yisrael v'loi b'nei Yisrael. And he brings countless examples. Kisei hadam. It says ish ish. Maybe it's ma'id a woman. Or shchutei chutz. Let's say it's ma'id a woman. Says the Rav Shlomo Kluger, there's so many mitzvahs. Why all of a sudden by Gid Hanasheh would we say, since you have a svara to a mamayit woman, we'll say only men are now to eat Gid Hanasheh and not a woman. But says Rav Shlomo Kluger, Lamaisa, the Chassam Sofer had a very important point. Because this Porger came in and he said, all you Jews, you got the wrong Gid Hanasheh. I have the right Gid Hanasheh. And the only reason we slugged up the Porger is based on the smag. Now, if this smag is not legitimate, then we should at least be choishesh for what this Porger said, and we should start taking out two nerves from every animal. So, says Rav Shlomo Kluger, we got to come up with some makar that the Gid Hanasheh exists in female animals in order to disprove this Porger. Otherwise, every Jew in the world is eating treif. So he finds makar that you have to say that the Gid Hanasheh is prevalent and exists in female animals, and not in male animals. It exists in female animals also. And his proof is as follows. His proof is, there's a Mishnah this is in the last paragraph in the Shal Shuvas Tuv Tamadas and Shuva Kuf, Madura Kama. Shlomo Kluger says, there's a Mishnah in Parak Gid Hanasheh, Daf Tzadi Gimel Amud Beis. And the Mishnah says that you're allowed to send the hindquarters to a guy with the Gid Hanasheh in it. How are you allowed to do that? Maybe we should be afraid that the guy will then give it to a Jew and be machshel the Jew and eating Gid Hanasheh. So the Mishnah says, it will be recognizable where the location of the Gid is. And the Rashi explains, it will be recognizable that the Gid was not taken out. So Frek Rav Shlomo Kluger, very nice, it will be recognizable that the Gid Hanasheh is there. But wait a second. If the Gid Hanasheh is something that only exists in male animals, does not exist in female animals, then why are we not afraid that the guy will sell it to a yid and say, you could eat it because there's but the yid will say, but the Gid Hanasheh is in it. We'll say, yeah, but it's a female animal. Must be that the Gid Hanasheh is Sayin males and Sayin females. I mean, from the fact that we're not worried that a guy will pass off a hindquarters and say, it's not a problem, this is from a nekeva, it must be the Gid Hanasheh exists in a zachar and a nekeva, and this is a proof that Porger was wrong, that the Gid Hanasheh, in fact, is something that exists both in men and in women. Okay. It's interesting, Rabbi Say, that in the Sefer Nachshoni, the Sefer Hagoyis with Parshas Torah, he also deals with this question on the Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz. That Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz, it seems like the Talmud Adam writes, maybe he made a mistake over here, that he misread the smag. So the Nachshoni explains, maybe a little bit of a very difficult explanation. He said Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz was a very clever man. And he was just trying to show how stupid the Porger was. So he said, the smag says it's noig b'zachar v'nekevos. Now everybody knows that what the smag means is that both men and women are now to eat the Gid Hanasheh. But Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz read it in this clearly mistaken way to show how gullible the Porger was, that he would fall for that misreading in the smag, not knowing that what the smag means is men and women can't eat from the hanasheh.
How are you allowed to do it?
You know, like we had in last week's Parsha, right? Achiv imay biramos. But it's a very difficult interpretation because Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz himself admits that this guy was a Talmud Chacham and a Baal Torah.
Looking back to the phrases in the beginning, the Mukha. Sounds a little funny.
Yeah, so it's a very difficult interpretation that Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz was intentionally misleading the guy. The guy was obviously no fool if he went around the entire Germany telling everybody that they got the wrong hanasheh and there were gedolim there. Nobody disproved the Porger. So Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz, to intentionally deceive him with an obvious, blatant misread of the smag, it's not mistaber that that's what Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz meant.
Why couldn't they just go to a female animal and see if it would be hanasheh?
They don't know what to
No, because this Porger said that in fact, what the correct identity of the hanasheh is not in a female animal. And basically there are two nerves. There's one nerve that's only in the male, and that's the nerve that this Porger maintained was hanasheh. And our Messiah it's a nerve that exists both in male and in female.
Rabbi Yonasan was a bucky. He runs a bucky Porger.
Yeah.
He can say, okay, here's a female animal, and here's the nerve.
Yeah, but the Porger said that you got the wrong one. It's a nerve that only exists. It's a nerve that only exists in the male. That's what he says.
Look at the anatomy. Look at the anatomy.
No, he said they got the wrong one. He said it's only the nerve that exists in only a male and not a female. He agreed.
Is that a legacies, though? In other words, in a female, is it different than from a male?
Yeah, there is a nerve that exists in a male that does not exist in a female, and there's a nerve that exists in both. Our tradition is the sciatic nerve is the one that exists in both. This Porger maintained that it was a different nerve that only exists in the male. They weren't arguing about anatomy. Everybody agrees there are two nerves. One exists in both and one exists only in one. The question is, which is the correct identity? Rabbi Yonasan was only able to disprove him from the smag that says that he claimed that it's a nerve that exists both in the male and the female.
But you have a chazaka of so many generations that this
And he says he got it wrong. It's like when I came, I went over to somebody once, I said, the halacha is that you're not allowed to talk by dami. He says, I have a different minhag. He says, my father talks, my grandfather talks. So they're different minhagim, Rebbe Vadia says the word minhag is oisios gehenim. So you have to watch out which minhagim you keep,
Well, this is not a minhag, this is a din.
Yeah, okay, so he says that there was a
They
mistake.
would know what the kid is. So many generations.
Yeah.
Everybody had it wrong. There's something.
In the Beis Yosef, he brings down also that there was somebody who did something similar to this with tefillin. That he said, everybody has the wrong Parshas, and he made them change. Okay, but in any event, yeah, it's a strange thing. Rabbi Sai, in all likelihood, Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz, who is a goyin adir and a goyin olam and a tzaddik nifla, he did not make a mistake. But divrei chachamim chayim v'kayomim, because in the 1930s there was a rabbi in Los Angeles, and not only was he a rabbi, but he was also a collector. His name was Shlomo Michal Neches. He died in 1957, and he actually bought in an auction the first edition of the Kresi Uplesi, the first printing of the Kresi Uplesi. And lo and behold, in the first edition of the Kresi Uplesi, not only was it the first printing, there were also marginal notes in the handwriting of Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz himself. And on this passage in the Kresi Uplesi, Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz in his own handwriting crossed out the words Samach Mem Gimel as a printer's error, and he wrote the following words: Samach Hey Nun. Samach Hey Nun. And the question is, now let's try to figure out what did Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz mean with those letters, Samach Hey Nun. So in the Pardes Yosef, in this week's Parsha, he says, look in the Chuvas of the Reb Shlomo Kluger, and about the story about the Porger who shook up the world. And in a journal, HaPardes, that was printed in Chicago, there's an article by Reb Shlomo Michal Neches, from Los Angeles, who had the first edition copy of Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz, and that was printed in Altona in the year Taf Kuf Chav Gimel, that is 1763, with the handwritten emendations of Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz himself, and he crossed out the letter Samach Mem Gimel, and on the side of the page he wrote Samach Hey Nun. Now we don't know what Samach Hey Nun is. What's Samach Hey Nun? Samach Hey Nun is a rare sefer called Seder Hilchos Nikar. And if you look in the Seder Hilchos Nikar, there in truth it's found that the Gid hanasheh is found in men and is found in women. In other words, male and female. And it's mamish a pella that none of the people ever looked in the smag, that everybody's mafalpel, what does the smag mean? Because B'chlal, the smag never even said anything of the sort. He doesn't even talk about what kind of animal the Gid hanasheh appears in. So this was the interpretation. Now, we give credit to Reb Shlomo Michal Neches for his personal copy of the first edition of the Kreisi Uplesi, but his interpretation of what Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz meant in his cross-out is not necessarily accurate. Because he interpreted it, just think for a moment, that Samach Mem Gimel was Samach Hey Nun. That means, where did the mistake come from? The printer, who read Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz's original handwriting, which he wrote Samach Hey Nun, and he read it as Samach Mem Gimel. That means, how many errors did the printer make? Two. That means he read Rabbi Yehonasan's Mem as a Hey, and he read Rabbi Yehonasan's Gimel as a Nun. Now, Nun and Gimel are very easily interchanged, right? If you make a Hebrew Gimel and a Hebrew Nun, it's only one little thing. But that he should misinterpret a Mem as a Hey, okay, look, mistakes happen. So interestingly, there's a tshuva in the Tzitz Eliezer in Chelak Ches Simin Chaf Hey, where the Tzitz Eliezer sort of gets involved in this controversy of what Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz meant, that the Smag writes the Noyeg beZacharim uVenekevos, and he brings down that Reb Shlomo Neches found the first edition of the Kreisi Uplesi, and on the side of it it's written Samach Hey Nun, which he says stands for Seder Hanikar. So first, the Tzitz Eliezer says, I would respectfully disagree, because I never heard of a sefer Seder Hanikar. There's a sefer, in other words, not the sefer Seder Hilchos Nikar, because I never heard of such a sefer, says the Tzitz Eliezer, but it probably stands for Seder Hanikar, which is a sefer, but a rare sefer. But says the Tzitz Eliezer, in all likelihood, the owner of the copy of the first edition of the Kreisi Uplesi, he probably misread Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz's handwriting. Yes, Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz crossed out Samach Mem Gimel, and he wrote Samach, what he thought was Samach Hey Nun, but he probably mistakenly read the Nun, it probably said Gimel. It probably, in Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz, wrote Samach Hey Gimel. And if Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz in fact wrote Samach Hey Gimel, the original printer only made one error. Instead of a Mem, he interpreted the Mem as a, instead of the Hey, he wrote instead of a Hey, he wrote a Mem. In that case, the original manuscript of the Kreisi Uplesi said Samach Hey Gimel, and the printer read it Samach Mem Gimel, and Rabbi Yehonasan corrected it back to the original writing, which is what? Samach Hey Gimel, and Samach Hey Gimel stands for what? Sefer Hilchos Gedolos, which is the Smag. Now, if it was the Smag, that would be a much more authoritative way to debunk the Porger than some random obscure sefer, Samach Hey Nun, Seder Hilchos Nikar. He probably wrote what Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz meant, Sefer Hilchos Gedolos, the Bahag, which is a classic sefer, and in that case, says Tzitz Eliezer, the mistake has been identified. The mistake doesn't lie with Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz. The mistake lies with the printer, and we know the printers make a lot of mistakes. And
We know where the original
But it doesn't.
does it say it in that sefer?
manuscript of the Kreisi Uplesi is? I mean, we have original manuscripts from him.
We have Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz's own handwriting that he wrote Samach Hey, with a letter which is not clearly identifiable, but clearly it's not the smag. It's either the Seder Hilchos Nikar or it's the Sefer Halachos Gedolos. In that case, what?
Yeah, it says that. Check that source.
Yeah, the Tzitzel Yezer says it does say it there. I didn't look. I have to give you something to do. But if that's the case, says the Tzitzel Yezer, that it's no wonder that the Gemara says in Erevin Adaf Yud Gimel that Rabbi Shmuel warned Reb Meir when Reb Meir told him that he's a sofer. He said, B'ni, be very careful, because maybe you're going to miss one letter and not to machav kol ha'olam kula, you're going to destroy the whole world. So you see a whole commotion and a whole movement jumps on a gadol b'Yisrael that he made an error, and the fault doesn't lie with Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz. The fault lies with the printer who is not careful in his work. But the conclusion is divrei chachamim chayim v'kayamim, and the godless of Rabbi Yehonasan Eibeshutz is apparent, and the error lies in the printer and in those who fail to realize that. They have a great day.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.